Okay, so I'm going to be focusing for the next 15 minutes or so on specifically future resilience for tenant farmers. Now, you might think that life looks a little bit like this at the moment. You know, lots of confusion, lots of things which aren't very clear. And, you know, in Greg's presentation, we've been hearing about things like ELM, and we don't yet know what the details of that will look like. There's all the talk about trade deals and whether we'll have protection on trade standards. There's issues around BPS. So lots of confusing things going on at the moment. And a lot of questions which we get from members of the TFA are around, okay, with all of this going on, what can we do? We can influence the policy, we can influence the trade deals, we can influence the direction of travel the government wants to take, but what can we do on our businesses? And I just want to go through a number of things that you might consider doing in your own circumstances. So the first thing that you might consider doing is looking at a rent review. And most tenancy agreements afford the opportunity for both landlords and tenants to trigger a rent review. And some people don't necessarily appreciate that the notice served for a rent review can be used by either party. So if the landlord serves the notice, the tenant can use the notice to argue for a reduction and vice versa. Now, there may be a significant gulf between the extent to which the landlord believes that they are able to extract rent from you and the extent to which you feel able to pay rent. And I see in some of the Q&A, there was a question about, well, what happens if we get a 5% reduction in BPS or even a bigger percentage reduction if you're on one of the higher levels of payment? Can we get a 5% reduction in rent? Well, BPS is a relevant factor in the rent review process. It's not a direct read across where you get a 5% reduction in BPS, you get a 5% reduction in rent, but it certainly is a relevant factor to take into consideration when you're having those discussions about rent review with the landlord. And it's also a really good discussion starter. So sometimes the service of a rent review notice can allow you to have a conversation with the landlord about other things, repairs, investments, or consents for improvements, or consents for diversification, or other things. So the rent review notice can be a trigger, not just for the rent review itself, but for other wider discussions. And also a question that often gets asked is, well, what percentage change should I expect? Well, that depends where you're starting from, obviously. So if you're paying a really low rent, you might not get any change in the level of rent, but if you're paying quite a high rent, you might see quite a large percentage change in the rent. Each individual circumstance needs to be looked at on its own merits. So I would absolutely advise that you take advice on those individual circumstances that you're facing. But what we're really looking for is sustainable levels of rent. We need rents that are going to make our businesses resilient into the long term, and we need to be properly considering how sustainable our rents actually are. The second thing is to understand your tenancy agreement. The very first question that we normally ask members when they ring us up for a question on their agreement or on what they can and can't do is, what does the tenancy agreement say? And actually, it may be a very long time since you last read your tenancy agreement to see what rights and responsibilities there are there. And another question that was raised in the Q&A was about tree planting. Sadly, most tenants are precluded from tree planting because many agreements will require tenants to use the holding for agricultural purposes only. So there may be some ability to use it for agroforestry, but maybe not for tree planting. The other issue is that quite often in tenancy agreements, you see landlords reserve rights to trees. But there are agreements where you are able to plant trees, and there are agreements where landlords haven't reserved trees. So it's really important to understand where the limits of your rights and responsibilities are and what your opportunities are with that agreement. So do dust off your agreement and have a look and see what you might be able to do under the terms of that agreement. And then the next thing is to clarify existing consents for diversification and look for new ones. Now, I'm surprised routinely at the extent to which tenant farmers are willing to invest in activities where they don't have good consent from the landlords, where there isn't written consent for things. And quite a lot of money is quite often invested in these situations. So do have a look and see if you have got the right consents for the diversification that you are undertaking at the moment. And if you need new consents or you're interested in getting a new consent, now is the time to look for those. And within the agriculture bill, at least for tenants regulated by the Agricultural Holdings Act, there will be provisions which will allow a tenant to object to a landlord's refusal to allow them entry into a financial assistance scheme. So if you've got a plan or an idea that is around diversification that you might be thinking about applying for some funding for from the government under its new provisions, and the landlord says no, then you might have a right to be able to argue with the landlord that that consent should be given. And there's no need to wait for those provisions to come online. So if you are looking at diversifications now, you could use the fact that you will have the opportunity at some point to argue that the landlord's refusal is unreasonable, to have a discussion with the landlord now about those types of diversification activities. So have a look and see whether you've got the right consents and whether you need further consents for that. The next thing that you can think about is to plan for succession, and particularly, again, for those under the Agricultural Holdings Act 1986, there is a general assumption that succession just happens. Well, it doesn't just happen. There's a lot of planning that needs to go into succession, including for something called the livelihood test, where the potential successor has got to show that they've taken their principal source of livelihood from farm work for 5 out of the past 7 years. So it's a really important task to ensure that your potential successor is able to meet those criteria if they're going to be able to succeed to the tenancy. And the other thing just to watch out for is that the agriculture bill is going to be abolishing something called the commercial unit test, which I won't bore you with today. But as part of a quid pro quo for that, the government has decided to raise the bar on suitability. So the suitability test is going to be strengthened so that you have to show that you've got a good ability in agriculture to run the holding. So it's not just a shoe-in terms of you being a close relative. So watch out for the livelihood test and also the changes in the suitability test to make sure that you are eligible to succeed. I believe that now is a good time to negotiate tenancy extensions. Now, if I was advising landlords, and as you know, I'm not, but for such a time as this, I would be saying to my clients, look, why don't you do a long-term agreement with a really good tenant who's going to be able to pay you a sustainable rent, and let them take the risk over the next period of time when all of this change is occurring. And there are some landlords, particularly on the traditional estates where perhaps they're not advised by some of the national firms of agents, are beginning to understand the benefit of doing that. And we are certainly seeing certain landlords looking at longer agreements. So there is an opportunity here, I think, to have a discussion with your landlord about looking at maybe negotiating tenancy extensions, particularly if you're under the 1995 Agricultural Tenancies Act. For some people, there is an exit strategy to think about as well, maybe even tenancy surrender. So when you are surrendering a tenancy, sometimes the landlord might be willing to give you a sum of money in return for that surrender. Now, the worst thing that you can do is to knock on the landlord's door straight after this webinar and tell them you want to surrender your lease, because your likelihood of getting some compensation for that is pretty slim. So you need to be planning and playing your hand very carefully to ensure that you can maximize whatever the landlord would be willing to pay you for the tenancy coming back into hand. Similarly, though, there are other things that you can build into that. So there's your live and dead stock, there's end of tenancy compensation for improvements and fixtures. And obviously something which Greg talked about in his presentation was the lump sum scheme that the government is beginning to think about and will be consulting on at the end of the year. And that will give you a lump sum from your surrender of your BPS entitlements. Now, again, there was a question in the Q&A about whether as a tenant you have the right to take those entitlements. The boring answer to that question is it very much depends on what's in your tenancy agreement. But I have to say, in the vast majority of cases, those entitlements sit in the hands of tenant farmers, are available to tenant farmers to use as they so desire, and they can take advantage of those schemes if the government comes forward with a lump sum payment. So surrender and tenancy surrender and exit strategies may be a reasonable route forward for some people. Don't forget about tax, and there are ways of avoiding tax. So the compensation payable for a tenancy is liable to capital gains tax. So you need to bear in mind that there may be some tax to pay if you are surrendering your lease, and to take advice about that. The next thing to say is take your decisions over additional land and contracting very carefully. I've been amazed down the years at the extent to which people believe they've got almost an unending ability to spread their fixed costs over additional land, and will bid over the odds on FBTs or contract farming arrangements just to get them in, forgetting the extent to which they're hammering their machines more and losing the timeliness of operations. And there was some work by Anderson's a few years ago which indicated that not only do people lose money on those opportunities, but they damage their profitability on their main holdings. And again, in the Q&A, there was a question about what I should put into a tender for a 5-year agreement. Well, you really do need to be doing your homework in terms of the potential for returns going forward, doing a 3-year cash flow and budget, and also looking at net worth as a start and the end of that 3-year period, and understanding your landlord as well. Some landlords are very much into wanting to see the environment improved, or maybe it's about the local communities or whatever. Other landlords just want top dollar, and obviously if you are in a game where you're just chasing the highest rent, the land may not be the right land for you if you have to pay over the odds just to get it. And if it means that much to you to lose money on it, then yes, certainly bid over the odds. But I think we need to be looking at sustainable levels of rent going forward for that. So do take care when you are taking on additional bits of land. As far as possible, avoid litigation. This is the cartoon from the 1600s, which indicates who are the real beneficiaries from litigation, and it's not the plaintiff or the defendant, as you can see in that cartoon. Litigation is expensive, it's stressful, it takes a long time, and it can bleed you dry. Or at least ensure you have insurance, and the TFA does have an insurance facility where you do end up at a court or tribunal or arbitration, where at least some of your costs may be covered. But try and do deals rather than end up before a court or an arbitrator, is what our advice would be. Also take good advice, and quite often in days before the COVID restrictions, I could well understand when there'd been a Skittles match somewhere in the country the night before, because my phone would be red hot with people indicating that they'd heard news on the grapevine about something which clearly wasn't strictly true. And don't think just because someone's got away with something, or someone's done something on their tenancy, or someone's managed to get a deal with their landlord, that you necessarily will. Tenancy agreements are a bit like fingerprints. Your individual circumstances need to be looked at individually, and you do need to take good advice. So don't necessarily be swayed by what you hear in the neighborhood is right or wrong. Do take proper advice from people that will understand your agreement, and obviously the TFA is available to assist you through that process. Then I would say, as a final point before we get in deeper into the Q&A, is to foster good landlord-tenant relationships. Sometimes the only person you see is the landlord's agent, but it is really important to try and get alongside the landlord, to get the landlord to understand you, for you to understand the landlord, because that's the way you really do cement long-term, profitable, productive relationships. And for those of you of a certain age, this isn't communication. This is more like communication. And obviously, at the moment, we are a bit restricted at the extent to which we can have the sort of face-to-face meetings. But it's really great to get your landlord out onto the farm, to show them what you're doing, to enthuse them about how you're improving their holding and how you're maximizing the use of their holding for both your benefit and their benefit. So it really is important to try and engender good long-term landlord-tenant relationships. And my very first meeting as the chief executive of the TFA was way back in 1997, when I sat in a Cornish farm kitchen with the landlord and the tenant of the holding, and both were extolling the virtues of each other. and I really got the sense that they had the best interest of both of themselves and the holding at heart when they were having that discussion. So good landlord-tenant relationships are much better than bad landlord-tenant relationships, and obviously the TFA is here to help you structure those discussions.